Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. Today we are going to hear about the book The Age of Sex Crime by Jane Caputi, and it's being discussed by Aurora Linnea. So thank you so much for coming, and over to you, Aurora.
Good morning, and thank you everyone for being here. This morning I will be talking about the book The Age of Sex Crime, which was published in 1987 by Jane Caputi. Let me first introduce Jane Caputi for those who are unfamiliar with her. Caputi is an eco-feminist writer and American culture studies scholar who currently teaches at Florida Atlantic University. Caputi studied with Mary Daly as an undergraduate at Boston College and drew inspiration from her as a mentor. Later, she would go on to collaborate with Daly as the co-author of Webster's first new intergalactic wikidictionary of the English language. That was published the same year as The Age of Sex Crime. And this Age of Sex Crime was Jane Caputi's first book, an outgrowth of her PhD thesis. Since then, she has written 3 additional books, Gossips, Gorgons, and Crones, The Fates of the Earth in 1993, Goddesses and Monsters, Women, Myth, Power, and Popular Culture in 2004, and Call Your Mother, a deliberately dirty-minded manifesto for the Earth Mother and the Anthropocene in 2020. I have to confess, I could not finish reading that most recent title, as Caputi in the first or second chapter begins enthusing over the subversive potential of fairy genders, and I couldn't continue. I couldn't persist with that. So I fear that she is not perhaps as radical a feminist as she once was, but her earlier work is absolutely essential reading. Caputi has also produced 2 documentaries, The Pornography of Everyday Life and Feed the Green, Feminist Voices for the Earth. I personally first encountered Caputi's work when I was in my mid-20s, and I happened upon Goddesses and Monsters while researching the misogynist mythos of the monstrous feminine. I immediately appreciated the real wittiness and wordplay of Caputi's writing, in which Mary Daly's influence is clear, and admired how she drew together patriarchal mythologies from myriad different periods and societies to illuminate the continuity of man-made culture across time and space, showing how the same foundational stories and ideologies just keep being manifested and show up even in contemporary pop culture, where we might not think that they're present because they've taken on new forms. The myths shapeshift, but the meanings and the social function stays the same. I was particularly excited to read The Age of Sex Crime because of my own questionable childhood preoccupation with serial killers and the far too many hours I spent on my mom's computer at work reading about these men's atrocities on Court TV's Crime Library website. While my fascination back then was more morbid than it was feminist, all of this reading did much to raise my awareness at an early age about the extremity of men's violence against women. When I discovered that Jane Caputi had written an analysis of these cases from a radical feminist perspective, I knew I had to read the book. And The Age of Sex Crime does not disappoint, though it is, I would warn any prospective readers, quite rough going, given the hideous nature of its subject matter. The book consists of 6 chapters, as well as an introduction and an epilogue. For the purposes of today's presentation, I'm just going to give a short overview of each chapter and focus on what seems most crucial to understanding our own sexually criminal patriarchal culture today in 2025. So Caputi introduces her book by contextualizing the work as a response to what has since been termed the golden age of serial murder, though dark age might be more appropriate, and that it's called the golden age is clearly misogynist inherently. This was the period between 1970 and 1990, which saw a surge of sexually brutal, highly sensationalized serial murders of women by men who are now infamous, like Ted Bundy, like the Hillside Stranglers, Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono, the Green River Killer, Gary Ridgway, Edmund Kemper, and Son of Sam shooter David Berkowitz. All of those men that I just listed are from the United States, but the UK had its own 70s star killer of women in Peter Sutcliffe, the so-called Yorkshire Ripper. This emergent stock figure serial killer of the 70s almost exclusively murdered women, with the exception of a few like John Wayne Gacy and Jeffrey Dahmer, who targeted teenage boys and young men. And all of these men raped and or sexually tortured and mutilated their victims. For this reason, Caputi defines these killings as crimes of sexual and political, essentially patriarchal domination, as well as functional phallic terrorism, though the political implications are obfuscated in mainstream analysis and representation. She goes on to write that the serial murders of this period are best understood as a contemporary form of gynocide, taking up the term that was introduced by Mary Daly in gynecology, and later defined by Andrea Dworkin as, quote, the relentless violence perpetuated by the sex class men against the sex class women. These killings expose the oft-referenced War of the Sexes as nothing less than a gynocidal massacre, definitively one-sided. It is, as Caputi writes, the ongoing warfare waged by men against women in order to continually enforce male dominance. Thus, she names the purpose of her book as being a study of sexually sadistic serial murder as a preeminent gynocidal ritual of 20th century patriarchy. She links this ritual to the archetypal creation myth of man-made culture, wherein some male god king slaughters a goddess and or female monster and thereby creates the world. The canonical example here would be the ancient Babylonian myth of the god king Marduk's murder of Tiamat, both a mother figure and a sea monster, as well as an embodiment of so-called primordial chaos in the sea itself. Marduk slays her and carves up her body, and from her dismembered corpse, man's heaven and earth is made. Caputi writes, through an initial act of sexual murder and mutilation, the male god purportedly gives form to the world. And world, of course, means the male-dominated, male supremacist social reality. For Caputi, the 19th century figure of Jack the Ripper then takes up the torch as a modern iteration of the gynocidal god-king creator of patriarchal myth. This unknown killer for the Jack the Ripper case was never solved. Of women in London's Whitechapel district has been immortalized as a legendary entity, revered as, Caputi writes, godlike, mythic, and heroic to his culture, despite the superficial pretense of his vilification. Caputi calls the Ripper a gynocidal archetype, whose mythos serves as the model for the sex crimes of her period. In this model, there is, quote, a pure fusion of sex and violence, which Caputi is quick to point out is not really so remarkable or unusual under male dominion. She writes, patriarchally defined and practiced sex becomes synonymous with and indistinguishable from violence, pain, force, humiliation, and domination. But what Jack the Ripper brought into the open in a new way, both out onto the streets and into the collective imagination, was the murder of women itself as being a sexual act. And it is this rise of murder as sex that Caputi views as setting the age of sex crime apart from past gynocidal eras. The first chapter is entitled The Ripper Repository, and considers the Jack the Ripper case, again, as the primary model for modern sex crime, and the mythic entity of the Ripper as a classification and categorizing tool invoked to describe to describe contemporary killers. So they're set in this space with the myth. Ripper becomes a label that can be attributed to this or that new murderer on the scene as a means to keep the myth alive, as Caputi writes. For those who have been somehow spared from the cultural Ripper mania that has made this misogynist murderer a household name, just to review, Jack the Ripper was a supposed serial killer who killed at least 5 impoverished women, several of whom were in prostitution, in London's Whitechapel district between 1888 and 1889. He stabbed and severely mutilated the women, focusing his ire on their genitals and reproductive organs. I say supposed serial murderer because no man was ever arrested in association with these crimes, and everything about his actual identity is speculative, and indeed much speculated upon obsessively. It's possible that multiple men were in fact responsible for the crimes rather than one single killer. Because these murders were so shocking and so brutal, and because they were committed during a period in history when the popular press was really in the ascendant, and because the identity of the killer remains unknown, the Ripper swiftly became an almost singularly high-profile mythic figure, the subject of a cultural fixation that endures today. The Ripper has been memorialized in countless novels, short stories, plays, TV shows, films, even pop songs. Caputi provides 2 reasons why the Ripper myth was kindled and why it has continued to be fed for so long. First, as she writes, the myth works to normalize violence against women. Such massive mythicization, she writes, works to ensure that phallic violence will be considered an unavoidable fact of life, an inevitability of nature. The myth of the nearly supernatural, unstoppable, uncatchable killer diverts attention away from any political analysis of sexual murder as an obvious product of male dominion, and instead naturalizes it as something merely bound to happen, a natural disaster, like storms or avalanches, in which women might unfortunately find themselves swept up and obliterated. Moreover, the myth embeds within the culture a template for the gynocidal ritual of sexually sadistic murder. Myths offer paradigms, scripts, follow-along procedures for behavior, as Caputi explains. The ritual is a reenactment of the myth, a recreation of the original event. In this case, that event is the slaughter of the goddess monster by the male hero, god, or king, that initial generative act of violence by which the patriarchal world comes into being. Through its regular reiteration within the culture, the myth and its hero attain an immortality that ensures that there will be imitators eager to claim such legendary status for themselves. In the case of sex crime, this means following in Jack the Ripper's bloody footsteps. The second chapter is entitled The Ripper Repetitions and follows the men who earn infamy as reenactors of the Ripper myth, so these imitators previously mentioned. Caputi notes that some actual killers have deliberately modeled their murders after the Ripper case, or they compare themselves to the Ripper as their icon and their idol. They express their hope to surpass him or to live up to the standard that he set. More often, however, it is the media that assigns the comparison, classifying various killers as Rippers, the Dusseldorf Ripper, for example, or the Yorkshire Ripper, and hyperfixating on any similarities that can be found between a contemporary case and the romanticized Ripper ideal. Caputi describes the formula that guides the gynocidal archetype of the Ripper. The killer stalks a particular territory. His victims are low-status, socially despised women, typically with some shared feature, long dark hair, for example. That was what was always cited in the Bundy case. He kills by a signature method or weapon. The craftier and more bizarre, the better. He involves the media, either by writing letters or leaving taunts at the crime scene. His violence conflates murder and mutilation with sex. And because of the fame of his crimes, he inspires copycats. Caputi writes that the media, when covering cases that at all resemble the Ripper model, has been inclined to prioritize establishing consistency with the myth and the ideal over reporting the real facts. Police, too, have muddied investigations through imposition of the Ripper formula. It is the myth, then, and not the reality of the crimes, and certainly not solving them or protecting women from murder, that is the important part. Through this emphasis on the myth, its melodrama and mystery, these crimes take on a supernatural cast. The killer emerges as a superhuman entity, and the fact that he is in reality just a man participating in male violence within a violent, male-dominated culture falls out of view. The creative extremity of his brutality lands him on a cultural pedestal, which at once absolves men in general and glorifies the Ripper and his crimes as an appropriate subject for widespread fascination. Caputi writes that there's always a dual resonance to the Ripper figure. Men admire him as an outlaw and as a hero in the Avenger mold, while also casting him as a monster, evil incarnate. She notes that in the 70s and 80s, serial killer lore often blended into that of the classic movie monsters, werewolves, vampires, phantoms. Both mythic traditions function to obscure the political reality of gynocide. But if the outlaw hero side of the story encourages men towards the work of maintaining male rule via sexual murder, the monster horror tale is meant for women, to create a state of siege so that women terrorized will withdraw from public life and submit to the good men who promise to protect us from the psycho killer bad guys prowling out there in the wider world. Thus, sex crimes perpetrated by individual men as patriarchal terrorists and broadcast for the purposes of instilling maximal female dread by the mainstream media facilitate the social control of women under male dominion. Taking up the analysis that was set forth by Susan Brown Miller, who died last month, by the way, in her 1975 book, Against Our Will, Men, Women, and Rape, in which she defines rape as an instrument of oppression, inflicted on individual women to keep all women afraid and in line. Caputi writes, manifestly, all instances of sexual terror serve as lessons for all women. One particularly appalling feature of sex crime terrorism that is addressed in this chapter is the cultural embrace of serial killing as fodder for jokes and general amusement. Caputi writes about a restaurant in Aspen, Colorado, where Ted Bundy escaped twice from jail while awaiting trial for the murder of 23-year-old nurse Karen Campbell. And this restaurant added a Bundy burger to its menu. The sandwich, hilariously, was just an empty bun. Open it and see the meat has fled, explained the related signage. She writes, too, of a parody advertisement for Scotch in the pornographic magazine Hustler, which featured the hillside strangler Kenneth Bianchi. In the ad, the name of the killer's final victim, 20-year-old Cindy Lee Hudspeth, is listed as Bianchi's latest accomplishment. The copy concludes, quote, after knocking off a couple of bimbos, the hillside strangler likes to kick back and relax with Dewar's light label. Hustler is the magazine famous for running a cover image of a woman upside down in a meat grinder. So this level of ghastliness is not really surprising. Still, it was a mainstream media product, a dominant culture phenomenon. In everyday heterosexual interactions, the sex crime joke takes the form of playfully menacing threats of violence, with men insinuating that they just might kill the women if they're not careful. Caputi writes, quote, "It is clear that when men jokingly assume the mask of the current Ripper, they are correspondingly demanding that women play along by identifying with the sexual victim. This repeatedly induced identification with rape and murder victims primes women not only for terrified submission, but also for masochism, the tethering of her sexuality to victimization, violation, and the annihilation of selfhood. Meanwhile, the man is getting off on a fantasy of gynocidal destruction, obviously not a harmless reverie. These jokes, this sort of teasing, these scripts for sexual play persist today. Killers and their victims remain figures of fun in the popular culture. I am reminded of the contemporary proliferation of horror comedies, this particular type of film in which violence against women typically is served up not merely as entertainment in the usual fashion, but with the callous, sneering irony characteristic of our current cultural ethos as lighthearted fare, a laugh riot. These films have always struck me as more mean-spirited even than their straightforwardly fetishistic counterparts. It's the shift from grim darkness to amused good cheer in the depiction of sexual sadism that seems to me most terrifying. Inciting another horrid hustler joke, a contest that promised free beaver hunt caps to readers who sent in nude photos, and illustrated by an edited picture of hillside stranglers Bianchi and Bueno, Bueno sporting the prize headgear. Caputi arrives at an observation that has stuck out to me since my first reading of the book. She writes, "The hunter reference, so superficially evoked here, actually is a pervasive and crucial one in the mythos of sex crime. Gynocidal murderers have framed their vocation as hunting more or less explicitly. Caputi quotes Edmund Kemper, who killed 6 young women, as well as his mother and her friend, later raping their corpses, as boasting, 'I was the hunter and they were the victims.' He also spoke of admiring his catch like a fisherman. Ted Bundy, speaking in the third person, as was his eerie, egoistic habit, recalled that what really fascinated him was the hunt, the adventure of searching out his victims. David Berkowitz, who shot a number of women in New York City and stalked them over time, declared, 'I love to hunt.' Caputi does not mention it, but there's also the Anchorage, Alaska serial killer Robert Hansen, a regular hunter of non-human animals for sport, who between 1972 and 1983 murdered at least 17 women, in some cases by releasing them into the forest and then hunting them down with a gun. In her analysis of the connection that is so repeatedly and unambiguously made here between the stalking and killing of women and the hunting of non-human animals, Caputi refers to the work of historian Richard Slotkin, who identifies the hunter as the archetypal hero of an American culture founded on, quote, "the violent and rapturously mythicized conquest of the wilderness." In his tremendous book, Regeneration Through Violence, The Mythology of the American Frontier, 1600 to 1800, Slotkin notes the markedly sexual character of this heroic hunter's violence and relates it to the recurrent mythic narrative in which a hero must slay a sacred animal, typically a deer, that represents the goddess of nature, in order to prove his virile vigor and fertilize the land so that it can provide for his needs. Hunting animals, violent but sacred heterosexual union, and the conquest of nature blend into one another here as the primal themes of patriarchal culture, granting men opportunities to actualize themselves as heroes via what Slotkin calls acts of violent self-transcendence and regeneration. For more on the entanglement of man's violence against non-human animals and against women, I would highly recommend André Collard and Joyce Contrucci's Rape of the Wild, as well as Brian Luke's Brutal, Manhood and the Exploitation of Animals, both excellent books. Whatever archetypal role the sex killer is slotted into, whether he's the hunter, the outlaw, the monster, or comic boogeyman, this icon of male dominion is, as Caputi writes, no matter how hypocritically reviled by his patriarchal culture, its ultimate man, its subliminal hero, the inevitable enactment of philocracy's most fundamental conceptions of manhood and godhood. This is the underlying premise of all the narratives of sex crime, she writes, the punchline behind all the familiar jokes and the allure of the first-person identification, the ordinary patriarchal man found behind the masks. Moving on to the third chapter, Caputi here focuses on the glut of mainstream entertainments revolving around serial murder that flooded US popular culture in the 70s and 80s. She focuses specifically on thriller novels of the sort that one might find in paperback form at an airport, so sort of pulp novels, though she also discusses films and radio hit rock songs as well. Fortunately, none of the novels that Caputi discusses as prime examples of the sex crime thriller genre have survived the intervening decades to enter the literary canon. So I'm not going to go into these texts individually, but look at them instead as lumped together as a cultural artifact expressive of the patriarchal worldview and its pathologies. Just as actual sex crime cases are molded to the Ripper myth, rendered formulaic in media narratives, if not necessarily in reality, fictional treatments of the subject likewise conform to a consistent set of plot points and themes. Caputi lists the genre's principal conventions: reference to the Ripper tradition, an abusive mother who is to blame for the killer's derangement, female victims who in some way provoke their own destruction, expressions of love by the killer for his victims, the conceit of serial killing as a holy war against women, which is tacitly condoned by the author throughout the text, and a strong identification between the good male detective or journalist who pursues the killer and the bad guy killer that's being pursued. Caputi looks at each of these elements to reveal how they encourage men to identify with murderers and, quote, vicariously thrill to the graphic and elaborate depiction of gynocide. She begins with how identification with the killer is cultivated via an absolute negation of sympathy for female victims, and indeed females en masse. The authors of sex crime thrillers achieve this by calling up misogynist tropes that shift the blame for sexual murder from the male murderers to the women of the world, generally speaking. The male murderer is presented as the real victim, for he has been traumatized by female cruelty. It's worth noting that contemporary incel logic is grounded in precisely this premise. Caputi shows how, again and again, the star serial killer's mother is demonized as the actual monster to blame for the crimes of her son, far more depraved than any man could ever be, because she has betrayed her sex role through violence against the innocent boy. The definitive cliche here would be the prostituted mother who exposes her son to her vile sexuality, perhaps involving him in it in some way, and thereby warps him for life. That's the story over and over again in slasher type films and in these novels as well. The blameworthy mother also dominates her son in classic pop Freudian fashion. Castration is her paradigmatic crime. In real life, too, serial killers have been all too happy to blame their mothers for the crimes that they commit, calling forth precisely the same tropes that are lined up to exonerate their fictional brethren. And they are believed and they are sympathized with within the male supremacist culture. Referring to his mother, whom he murdered and raped, Edmund Kemper told interviewers, "6 young women are dead because of the way that she raised her son." Kemper's mother was, of course, domineering and aggressive, so it is said. As Caputi writes, quote, "The word of the rapist, cannibal, necrophile, and matricide is accepted unquestioningly by representatives of the patriarchate because he is also a man mouthing patriarchal truisms. Only the self-absolving refrains of male voices and male versions are heard." In sex crime literature, if the mother is to blame for the basic psychological composition of the son as murderous sex maniac, each individual female victim is personally culpable for inciting him to kill her. Again, displays of sexual aggression or dominance are a major trigger since they put the man in fear of castration. If the female victim is in any way predatory, she is a man-eater, and again, her murder is justifiable self-defense against castration. Maybe she nags, or she is in some way treacherous, teasing, and coy. Perhaps she tries to trick the killer somehow to avoid being murdered by him, thus confirming his view of women as deceptive, hence evil. If he hadn't planned to kill her before, now he has no choice. The killer's victims are incessantly characterized in terms of the ancient and patriarchally beloved mythology of female evil that forms the nucleus of endemic misogyny. If you're interested in this mythology, 2 books to check out would be Wolfgang Lederer's The Fear of Women and H.R. Hayes' The Dangerous Sex, The Myth of Feminine Evil. Both are mid-20th century books by male writers, therefore limited as far as their feminism goes, but quite invaluable and comprehensive compendiums of misogynist lore, nonetheless. In the novels that Caputi analyzes, penned by men in the late 70s and 80s, at the height of the women's liberation movement and in its wake, another major blunder by which a woman might solicit her own murder was being feminist. One book that she discusses, George Stade's Confessions of a Lady Killer, which happily I had never heard of prior to reading Caputi's work, so hopefully it's just like disappeared. This book forthrightly adopted this cause and effect, feminism to murder sequence as its premise. In the book, the killer hero targets the feminists that he perceives as having corrupted his wife, who left him to work for a feminist magazine. Within the logic of the fiction, as Caputi writes, women in the form of feminists constitute an attack on men, which must be avenged. 2 years after The Age of Sex Crime was published, Marc Lapine entered an engineering classroom at Montreal's École Polytechnique, ordered the male students to leave, and then shot all 9 women left in the room. He then wandered through the building for another 20 minutes, shooting at women in the halls, the cafeteria, and another classroom before he killed himself. Lapine murdered 14 women and injured a number more. In a letter leaked to the press, Lapine declared his intention to kill radical feminists, whom he blamed for ruining his life. It's useful to remember, when we're faced with violent male hostility for voicing feminist criticisms of contemporary expressions of male dominance, which includes, obviously, transgenderism, that there exists an established tradition of patriarchy's foot soldiers viewing feminism as a crime punishable by death. The rage and the urge to vengeance incited in men by women's refusal to submit to and to support them has not cooled. It is as fierce as ever, though equipped with a new and newly persuasive cover in the widespread legitimization of violence against so-called TERFs. Caputi also observes how in sex crime entertainment, in addition to being blamed for getting themselves killed, female victims are robbed of any humanity or sympathy, making them ludicrous, despicable, and deserving of death. Feminists, naturally, bear the worst of this character assassination. There is no way to care about any of these female characters or what happens to them, since male authors have purposely crafted them to be loathsome. For these cultural texts to be successful in their social function, their cast of female characters must be totally hideous to ensure that all identification and sympathy runs towards the male hero, no matter how horrible his crimes may be. Audience affinities are further manipulated through another constant feature of the sex crime thriller, the burgeoning brotherhood between the hero detective and the monstrous killer. In the process of investigating the killer's crimes, the detective develops a begrudgingly admitted admiration for his rival. He gets into his head, and as he comes to understand him and his motivations, what makes him tick, the hero begins to mirror the monster in small or significant ways. Thus, an underlying unity between lawman and criminal is revealed, as Caputi writes. To use the sort of trendy Jungian terms, we could see the serial killer as the shadow side of the detective. Caputi quotes Andrea Dworkin, who writes, quote, "In male culture, males who enforce the standards are heroic, and so are those who violate them. It is a mistake to view the warring factions of male culture as genuinely distinct from one another. In fact, these warring factions operate in near perfect harmony to keep women at their mercy." Through the propagation of entertainments which prompt men to align themselves with rapists and murderers, and which normalize rape and murder as the stuff of sexual fantasy, the patriarchal culture contributes to this harmonious subordination of women. The media representations marketed as fun. Caputi points out that Alfred Hitchcock called his film Psycho a fun picture, are the symbolic accompaniment to the actual enactments of gynocide. Caputi explains that by recapitulating the myth of the gynocidal hero, these texts serve a ritual function for male dominion. The rules of male dominance and female submission are dramatized. Men's faith in male power and women's terror of it are renewed. And the fundamental patriarchal practice of female sacrifice is celebrated. The next chapter, Professional Victims, turns to the women who are targeted by serial killers. Caputi asks what the symbolic role of the sacrificial female in the gynocidal ritual is. As per the Ripper model, the paradigmatic victims of sex crime killings are prostituted women. There's an obvious practical reason for this. Prostituted women are more likely to be poor and socially marginal, therefore comparatively easy for violent men to access and to kill with impunity, since authorities are not overly concerned when such women disappear. In the United States, some of the most prolific serial killers have specifically targeted Black women in prostitution, and it's not a coincidence that these men were able to murder so many victims before being caught. The women that they killed were simply considered disposable. But pragmatism has not been the sole motivation for targeting women in prostitution. A number of killers also chose prostituted women out of hatred for them as dirty or sinful. Yorkshire Ripper Peter Sutcliffe, most of whose 13 victims were in prostitution, referred to himself as the street cleaner. Men like Sutcliffe have viewed it as their noble, even sacred mission to rid their cities of the corruption they saw embodied in the prostituted woman. By the media and law enforcement, the murders of these women are dismissed as to be expected. The women had it coming. They are not innocent victims. Implicit in media representations is the judgment that their destruction by gynocide is a reasonable punishment for their fallen state. Thus, as Caputi writes, prostituted women are the professional victims of sex crime, custom made by patriarchy for the role of the female evil that must be purged to maintain patriarchal social order. Caputi likens the targeting of prostituted women as sacrifices in the gynocidal ritual with the targeting of poor, unruly, unmarried, or otherwise out of order women as witches during the so-called witch craze of the 14th through 18th centuries, which really peaked in the 15th and 16th century. The witch is the preeminent icon of female evil, a hypersexualized concubine of the devil. Often enough, women accused of witchcraft were tortured into confessing to really elaborate and strange sexual relations with the devil and his sundry demons, for which sin they would be executed. Caputi writes that the man-made archetypes of the whore and the witch both represent female carnality, duplicity, guile, and total immorality. In other words, all of the qualities that comprise the negative aspect of the iconic figure woman as man has imagined her. By projecting this negative image onto a select group of women, whether that category is whores or witches, the patriarchal culture can symbolically rid itself of the disruptive element that they represent. Then men can feel safer, confident that the male-dominated social order has been bolstered and that any women who remain docile wives and mothers and housemaids pose no threat to them. This is why gynocidal campaigns like the witch craze and the age of sex crime erupt during periods of cultural upheaval, when the role of women in particular is dramatically shifting. In 15th century Europe, as well as the mid-20th century United States, women were stepping into new positions in public life, and more women were roaming about unmarried, outside the direct control of any male master. The gynocides that emerged during these periods were therefore serving a therapeutic function for patriarchal society, as Caputi argues, by helping to pinion women back under men's control through terrorism. Given the utility of these massacres, Caputi writes that it is wrong to think of them as aberrations. They are in no way deviations from the patriarchal norm, but strategic enforcements of that norm. The witch craze was not a craze at all. It was, in fact, a, quote, planned and powerful persecution, perfectly synchronized with the values and needs of a patriarchal order. To call it a craze, as if it were some freak occurrence, is just another convenient deflection from the politics of gynocide. Caputi calls this cover story the Mask of Insanity and shows how it has been similarly applied to sex crimes, though through casting the serial killer as an anomaly and an outsider and a psychopath. This latter label, though, exposes its function as a mask quite clearly through the vagueness of its own definition. Caputi explains that the concept of the psychopath was developed by a 19th century physician who used it to describe patients who were morally insane, yet somehow able to lead apparently completely normal lives. Outwardly normal, they were secretly, inwardly insane. But if insanity passes perfectly for normalcy, what does that then say about sanity or ideas of sanity? In the 20th century, psychopath was popularized as the default label for sex crime killers, with boy next door, handsome and charming, allegedly, aspiring lawyer Ted Bundy being the paradigmatic example. But again, if the primary indicator of psychopathy is normalcy, then how can the psychopath be abnormal? Caputi quotes a criminal psychologist who described the sexual sociopath as appearing not only normal, but hyper-normal. And she refers to another researcher on psychopathy who concluded that, quote, the psychopath cannot be considered ill or even seriously out of phase with typical American values, and who proposed that the psychopath is not an antisocial personality, but in fact, a heavily socialized one. In a male-dominated society in which sex and violence are fused, and in which male power must be continually reinforced, men who rape, murder, and terrorize women are not abnormal, aberrant lunatics. They are instead hyper-normal, consummately loyal agents of their fatherland. They are not antisocial, not out of sync with their society, but heavily socialized. They have perfectly internalized their society's values and imperatives and dutifully act upon them. The persecution of women accused of witchcraft and the sexual murder of women by serial killers are therefore both logical products of the cultures in which they occurred. The gynocidal ritual is not countercultural, but a crucial feature of man-made culture. Caputi writes, though nominally criminal, these murders are in truth desired, approved, institutionalized, and ultimately mandated. The next chapter, the fifth chapter, is one in which Caputi makes the case for recognizing gynecology and psychiatry as what she terms companion ideologies to sex crime. Both reduce women to our sexual organs, and both treat women as symbols of sex and/or sexuality itself. In both fields, male professionals endeavor to cure women of nonconformity to feminized subordination. And male sexual violence against women is either directly enacted, as in the mutilating treatments of early gynecology, or it is excused, as it has been by the psychoanalytic theory of female masochism. In these ways, gynecology and psychiatry operate in service of patriarchy. As Caputi points out, gynecology as a medical practice was coming into its own during precisely the same late 19th century period as the Jack the Ripper murders were taking place in London. Also notable is the common hypothesis that the Ripper himself was a medical doctor, based on the surgical skill supposedly evidenced by his mutilations. Caputi refers to Mary Daly's critique of gynecology, which she identified as an institutionalized arm of violence against women. In the 19th century, so-called female castration by means of ovarectomy, the removal of the ovaries, was a regularly prescribed treatment for disorderly women turned over to doctors by their dissatisfied husbands and fathers. These surgeries were indicated for women who demonstrated symptoms of female sexuality, such as desire, masturbation, and even orgasm. On the whole, female sex organs and female sexuality were, for the gynecologist, diseased and in need of immediate male remediation, ideally by use of the knife. The parallel here between gynecology and sex crime calls for no real clarification. As Caputi writes, to correct the disorders and potential social disruptions caused by women's bodies and female sexuality, quote, women were unsexed. The criminal taint of femaleness was literally rooted out. Such was the punishment for the sex crime of being female, for living in biological defiance to the man's world. Although ovarectomy largely fell out of fashion by the turn of the century, the gynecological establishment's enthusiasm for excising women's sexual parts carried on undampened. Caputi cites the rise in hysterectomies and radical mastectomies in the United States during the 20th century, procedures that were widely recommended in spite of negligible evidence of their medical benefit. In the absence of a significant therapeutic or prophylactic rationale for such surgeries, Caputi attributes their popularity to the male-dominated medical institutions' ingrained hostility towards the female body, its sexual and reproductive anatomy in particular. She quotes an American gynecologist who describes the uterus as a useless, bleeding, symptom-producing, potentially cancer-bearing organ that ought to be removed more or less immediately after a woman has finished up bearing children. Today, we have a medical industry that is entirely delighted to expunge the femaleness of countless young women by means of cosmetic mastectomies, hormone treatment, and experimental genital surgeries. So the mutilation continues. Caputi's review of gynecological violence is an important reminder that medicine has never been neutral. It developed as a patriarchal institution, and it operates as such still today. Its purpose, not merely the maintenance of health, but also of male power, not merely the treatment of disease, but of perceived social maladies as well. With psychiatry, the mutilating and dissecting instrument of the patriarchal doctor is lifted from the female sex organs to the female psyche. The presumption that women are essentially defined by sex and sexuality, however, remains in place. To trace the relation between psychiatry and sex crime, Caputi highlights three major fixations of Freudian psychoanalysis. First is the notion of woman as castrated, marked by her lack of a penis, which the male observer perceives as a horrific mutilation. The vagina is literally characterized as a wound. Caputi writes, Freudian psychology constructs a paradigm which poses the female genital to be innately in a state of mutilation. If the female genital is a wound, a product of an imagined mutilation, sex crime is the concrete manifestation of that imaginary fact. Through the sex killer's assault, what is imagined as a wound becomes one, and male fantasy is affirmed. Additionally, the woman's phallic lack and the wound she suffers there in its place means that she is anatomically designed to be attacked. And whether she knows it or not, her instincts yearn for the assault, even invite it. She is masochistic by nature, a born victim. This setup helpfully excuses all violence that men inflict upon her. Next is Freud's theory of fetishism. The basic idea here is that the man, terrified by the phalluslessness of the castrated female, soothes himself by attaching to some other body part or object that he can imagine as a substitute for the strangely and frighteningly absconded member. Broadly understood, anything used as a phallic symbol is a fetish, invoked by men to cope with their fear of castration, or women, or the many awful things that women represent. Freud himself wrote that sharp weapons are among the most readily accessible symbolic substitutes for the phallus, as, quote, objects which share with the thing they represent the characteristic of penetrating into the body and injuring. Once again, the sex crime connection is obvious. When sex is violence and violence sex, penetration by penis or by blade are equivalent and equally gratifying acts. Freud goes on to name knives, daggers, spears, sabers, firearms, rifles, pistols, and revolvers as suitable fetish objects. To this phallic artillery, Caputi adds nuclear missiles, through which sexual thrills are to be found, quote, in the phallotechnic fusion of man to killing machine. She continues, idealized virility is thus gleefully fused to weaponry and to an unprecedented and earth-destroying lethality. Nuclear apocalypse lurches to the fore as the ultimate form of sexual murder. Finally, Caputi addresses men's fear that they will be castrated by the female herself, since her phallic lack transforms her in the male mind into a castrator, eager to deprive the man of his own personal prized penis, as she has been deprived of hers. Accordingly, as Caputi writes, women are proclaimed the mutilating and lethal aggressor against men. She relates this to the patriarchal myth of vagina dentata, the idea that a woman's vagina is ringed with sharp teeth and is driven by insatiable hunger to bite off men's penises, yes, castrating them. Caputi submits the 1975 horror film Jaws about a killer shark as an example of modern vagina dentata fear-mongering, and adds that many female deities associated with the ocean were, with the ascent and consolidation of male rule, deformed into sea monsters. In any case, the consequence of the castration-phobic man and his man-made culture characterizing women as predatory, phallus-devouring femmes fatales is that it gives men absolute justification for their actual annihilation of women. Caputi argues that the mythology of the woman as monster against whom man must defend himself experiences a renaissance in accompaniment to all gynocidal campaigns. The fin de siècle era of the original Ripper produced a literature that is laden with cold-hearted, bloody-mouthed, and seriously dangerous females. Just as an example. Caputi closes the chapter by arguing that women are endlessly reduced to symbols within patriarchal culture, and often symbols of whatever men fear and reject. This reduction serves the twofold purpose in the facilitation of gynocide. Female personhood is denied, such that women can be homogenized into the patriarchal icon woman, who is then systematically demonized. Male survival and the survival of man-made civilization depends on her eradication. The final chapter, which shares its title with that of the book, deals with sex crime as a quintessentially modern practice. Caputi explains that when she defines her contemporary moment as the age of sex crime, she is classifying such killings as a key sign of the times, a root paradigm, a practice that expresses precisely what the patriarchal world is doing. She goes on to identify other practices and phenomena similarly expressive of the ethos of the man-made culture as it stood at her time of writing. In addition to the age of sex crime, for Caputi, it was also the age of mechanical reproduction, of the media and the camera, of pornography, fashion, television, the computer, plastic, technology, space, and the nuclear. Some of these still apply to our own patriarchal world of the 21st century, others less so, and certainly we have our own that we can think of. The remainder of the chapter looks to each of the above for how they relate to sex crime. Where do the various phenomena and practices collide, and what are the products of their collisions? How do they interlock and reinforce one another? I'm not going to review all of them. Obviously, we have like 4 minutes left, but only a few that seem most instructive in analyzing our current age. Caputi calls pornography the principal propaganda of the ongoing gynocidal crusade, a sacred text of the age of sex crime. She writes, quote, "It is in pornography that the basic meanings of sex crime are distilled, the female body fetishized, displayed, sacralized, only so that she can be hated, possessed, profaned, and sacrificed." And as Caputi observes, serial killers themselves have been avid consumers of pornography. Sizable porn collections are found in their homes. They make pornography of themselves, torturing their victims. Like Ted Bundy, they sometimes mention porn's influence on their own sexualities. But when Bundy identified porn as a factor in his turn to a career as a rapist and murderer, his criticisms of pornography were dismissed and even mocked as his attempt to eschew responsibility for his actions. However explicit the linkages between pornography and male violence, porn's defenders are always ready to swoop in to deny and to minimize them. Caputi also discusses the conversion of women into dolls, a preoccupation common to serial killers, pornography, fashion, and advertising, and one clearly associated with other phenomena she names, namely mass production, plastic, and technology. Her analysis here draws from media theorist Marshall McLuhan's concept of the mechanical bride. For McLuhan, the mechanical bride was the major icon of mid-century sorry, my phone was doing something weird. For mid-century industrialized society. Representing the interfusion of sex and technology. In the figure of the mechanical bride, the feminization and eroticization of technology is paired with a mechanization of the female body. McLuhan was writing in the 1950s, but by the time Caputi published The Age of Sex Crime in the late 80s, the mechanical bride had ascended to even greater prominence. And today, popular culture normalizes men's masturbatory use of, sorry, is my volume okay? Sorry, just making sure everything's working. So today, popular culture normalizes men's masturbatory use of pornified corpse-like silicone simulation females. For a chilling review of our own contemporary age of the doll, I'd refer you to Caitlin Roper's Sex Dolls, Robots, and Woman Hating. To articulate the connection between dollification and gynocide, Caputi writes, "The partial, plastic, objectified, unreal, dead, and dismembered women of fashion and pornography reflect and propagate the Ripper Eye view of the world." She also ties in reproductive technologies here because the mechanical bride, even more than a sex object, represents the enduring patriarchal dream of extracting living women and biology, mammalian biology, from procreation and replacing it with a smooth mechanized process. In a brilliantly grim summing up, Caputi writes, "The only possible consummation of the final funereal marriage of mankind to the mechanical bride would be the total contamination and or destruction of the elemental earth, and a final ensconcement in an artificial and dead environment." As if it could get any more bleak, Caputi finishes by exposing the relationship between sex crime and nuclear war, a resurgent concern in our current age. And nuclear war is and always has been emblematic of male dominion. The missiles are phallic, nuclear weapons manufacture and stockpiling a lethal pissing contest between nation-state warlords. And the willingness to destroy the earth that it bespeaks is underlined by a morbidly misogynistic and biophobic urge for vengeance against the mother symbol that men have made of the earth and violated and abused unrelentingly ever since. Nuclearism is the height of patriarchal psychopathology. And so, as Caputi writes, in her era, and no less in ours, the ghost of the Ripper, that sex killer hero of legend, hovers over all the man-made world and its institutions. He must be stopped, she urges, and the task of stopping him is ours now, for he is still at large. He is larger now than ever. Thank you. That's it. Sorry to rush through at the end there a little. I just don't want to go over time.
Thank you so much, Aurora. That was absolutely amazing. I'm sure lots of us will watch this again and we'll share widely. See everybody next week. Thanks, Aurora, again. It was brilliant.
Thank you. Thank you very much.